I paused and he said, "Why are you doing this?" And I said, "I've been wanting to do this for a long time, murder someone." And then I continued. I cut open his belly to see his guts. They're really pink. Sorry, that was morbid. Is it okay if I do a demonstration?
Oh, yeah.
This is him. I was straddled on top of him like this.
Okay.
And he couldn't fight back. It was actually surprisingly easy. I was barely breaking a sweat. I thought, oh, this guy, he's going to be tough. But no, it was actually surprisingly easy.
March 1st, 2021. Grand Junction, Colorado. A human hand is discovered near a creek, cleanly severed, partially frozen, and unmistakably real. By nightfall, more body parts begin surfacing, and with them a name: Warren Barnes. He was a gentle man with nowhere to go. Quiet, private, known for one thing: he was always reading. For years, Warren sat near the Mesa Mall with a book in his hands and a calm presence that comforted strangers. People called him the reading man. He didn't beg. He didn't shout. He just read. And then, one winter night, he disappeared. Grand Junction isn't a city known for headlines. Nestled between the Colorado River and red sandstone cliffs, it's a place of desert sunsets, quiet neighborhoods, and small-town familiarity. Locals don't lock their doors. People wave from porches. Everyone knows someone. And everyone knew Warren. Warren Barnes was 69 years old. He didn't have a home, but he had a routine, sunrise to sundown, sitting in the same spot near the Dillard's entrance. He read sci-fi novels, classic philosophy, anything people donated. He didn't talk much about his past, but he had kindness in his eyes and a way of making silence feel safe. Then, in late February, Warren vanished. At first, no one panicked. He'd occasionally go unseen for a day or two, especially during bad weather. But this time, he didn't come back. His chair stayed empty, his books untouched. People left snacks, water, a fresh blanket, still nothing. And then came the news. On March 1st, police announced they'd found human remains near the Redlands area, just outside city limits. The body had been dismembered. Pieces were recovered in multiple locations. It was gruesome, unthinkable, and soon undeniable. The man known for turning pages had become the center of a chilling homicide investigation. It began with a grim discovery. On the morning of March 1st, 2021, a passerby near the banks of the Gunnison River stumbled upon what looked like a large piece of meat, reddish, swollen, but clearly human. It was a severed hand. Police were called immediately. Within hours, Mesa County Sheriff's deputies, forensic teams, and Grand Junction police descended on the area. Search dogs and divers joined in. What they uncovered was straight out of a nightmare: dismembered body parts, scattered in bags and buried shallowly near the water's edge. Each find raised the same terrible question: who would do this? The remains were later identified as belonging to Warren Barnes, a 69-year-old unhoused man who had been missing for several days. His face was familiar to anyone who shopped at the Mesa Mall. When he didn't return to his usual spot with a book in hand, people noticed, but no one expected this. There was no 911 call about a violent attack. No reports of screams or missing persons. Just silence. Investigators began retracing Warren's steps, piecing together his last known movements. He was last seen alive on February 27th, near his usual place outside the mall. He left with someone quietly. That night, he never returned. Surveillance footage from local businesses helped narrow down a timeline. But what confused police was the lack of any obvious motive. Warren didn't have enemies. He wasn't involved in drugs. He had no known mental health issues or family feuds. The attack was excessively violent: dismemberment, multiple wounds, signs of attempted concealment. Yet the victim lived a quiet, solitary life. Then came a break. A witness tipped off investigators that a young man, someone they vaguely knew, had recently been acting strange. He was talking about violence, referencing books about serial killers, even joking about harming someone. His name, Brian Cohey Jr. At just 19 years old, Brian was known to police, but not for anything like this. He had no prior violent convictions. Still, investigators followed up. They visited his home, hoping for an interview. What they found was horrifying. Inside Brian's bedroom closet was a large plastic container. Inside the container was Warren Barnes' severed head. The shock hit investigators like a freight train. Not only had Brian kept the head, he had filmed parts of the murder on his phone. He had also documented it in a written confession on his computer. The confession described the act in cold detail, how he lured Warren into his car, stabbed him, and dismembered him with a hacksaw under a highway overpass. It was not spontaneous. It was premeditated. Brian told police he wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone.
I paused and he said, "Why are you doing this?" And I said, "I've been wanting to do this for a long time, murder someone." And then I continued. I cut open his belly to see his guts. They're really pink. Sorry, that was morbid. Is it okay if I do a demonstration?
Oh, yeah.
This is him. I was straddled on top of him like this.
Okay.
And he couldn't fight back. It was actually surprisingly easy. I was barely breaking a sweat. I thought, oh, this guy, he's going to be tough. But no, it was actually surprisingly easy.
Suddenly, the search for a killer was over. But what lay ahead was far darker. A portrait of a young man obsessed with violence, craving control, and choosing a vulnerable stranger for one reason only, because he could. Before he became a headline, Warren Barnes was something else entirely, a man defined not by how he died, but by how he lived. To the people of Grand Junction, he was a familiar face. A quiet figure, always tucked beneath the awning outside Dillard's. Thin frame, graying beard, a plastic chair beneath him, a book in his lap, and a sense of peace that seemed out of place in a world so loud. They called him the reading man. He didn't ask for money. He didn't interrupt people. He simply sat and read science fiction, westerns, philosophy. Anything that was left for him, he read. Over time, he became a kind of fixture in town. Mall employees would bring him lunch. Strangers dropped off blankets in the winter, water in the summer. Parents pointed him out to their kids. See? That man's always reading. He must be very smart. But Warren's story, like so many unhoused individuals, was more complicated than it looked. He'd once had a life before the streets. Former acquaintances said he was quiet but intelligent, thoughtful, a bit of a loner but never cold. He didn't talk about his past, never said where he was from, what had happened, or why he ended up without a home. But to those who offered kindness, he returned it. There were no outbursts, no signs of addiction, no criminal record, just a man surviving. He was known by staff at the nearby Barnes & Noble, where he'd sometimes read for hours. Employees at the food court gave him leftover meals. When winter came, locals dropped off coats and mittens. People saw Warren as harmless, a part of the landscape, but also somehow above it. After the news of his murder broke, the community didn't just grieve. They ached. His absence left a silence in town. A chair left empty. A story without a last chapter. In interviews, store managers called him gentle and respectful. One said, he was never a problem. If anything, he made the place feel safe. Others spoke of his calm presence, his soft smile, and the way he seemed to carry entire worlds inside his books. Warren had no known surviving family. But Grand Junction became his family. And after his death, they made that bond permanent. In 2021, a bronze statue was installed near the Dillard's entrance at Mesa Mall, the place where Warren spent so many years. It's not flashy, just a chair, a pair of glasses, and a book forever left open. It's a tribute not just to the man they lost, but to the life he led and the peace he gave to others, even when he had none himself. From the beginning, something about the murder didn't make sense. There was no robbery, no drugs, no romantic motive, and no sign of a struggle. Whoever killed Warren Barnes had done so deliberately and with methodical cruelty. When detectives began tracking Warren's final movements, they turned to surveillance footage from February 27th. It showed Warren leaving his usual post outside Mesa Mall. He got into a car willingly. That detail alone struck investigators. It wasn't an abduction. It was a ride he chose to take. But why? The vehicle, a black Honda sedan, was traced back to Brian Cohey Jr., a 19-year-old Grand Junction resident. Quiet, bookish, a former honor student at Central High. No criminal record, no known history with Warren. On paper, Brian looked like the kind of kid you'd see at a coffee shop with a laptop, not the center of a murder investigation. But behind closed doors, something was unraveling. Detectives served a warrant on Brian's home on March 2nd. What they found was beyond disturbing. In his bedroom closet was a large plastic storage container, sealed and tucked behind coats. Inside was Warren's severed head. That was only the beginning. A sweep of Brian's computer revealed a typed confession, titled with Warren's name. In chilling detail, He described picking Warren up under the pretense of offering a warm ride. They drove west under an I-70 overpass. That's where it happened. Brian stabbed Warren repeatedly in the neck and chest, then watched him die. He wrote about it like a science experiment, methodical, emotionless, detached. He admitted to dismembering the body with a handsaw and kitchen knives, some of which he purchased specifically for the task. Afterward, he stored the head in his closet and scattered other remains across remote areas near the Colorado River. Why? That question would come to define the investigation. During interviews, Brian gave no clear motive. He described the killing as something he wanted to try. He had been reading about serial killers for years. He was obsessed with their psychology. But this wasn't fantasy anymore. He made it real. Investigators also learned that Brian had researched how to commit murder online, including body disposal techniques and the legal definition of insanity. He had written stories, dark, violent, and eerily specific. The signs had been there, but no one had noticed. Friends from school said Brian was quiet, intelligent, and kept to himself. A few remembered him talking about death. Others dismissed it as dark humor. His parents later said he had struggled with depression, but no one imagined it could manifest like this. And then came one final revelation. Brian had recorded video on his phone, clips before and after the murder. Not the act itself, but commentary. His voice was calm, almost proud. He didn't seem scared or panicked. He seemed fascinated. Suddenly, the case against Brian Cohey Jr. wasn't just strong, it was airtight. The reading man, chosen at random, had become the target of a young man's twisted curiosity. And now the question wasn't who did it, but why he thought he could get away with it. In most murders, motive is the thread that pulls the story together. Jealousy, money, revenge. But in the case of Warren Barnes, there was no affair, no betrayal, no business deal gone wrong. Instead, there was something colder, and infinitely more disturbing. Obsession. Brian Cohey Jr. wasn't in love with Warren. He wasn't angry at him. In fact, he barely knew him at all. What Brian was obsessed with was murder itself. The deeper detectives dug into Brian's online life, the darker it became.
I paused and he said, "Why are you doing this?" And I said, "I've been wanting to do this for a long time."
On his computer, investigators uncovered an entire archive of content devoted to violence. True crime forums, Reddit threads about dismemberment, detailed write-ups of historical serial killers, notes on Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, Edmund Kemper. February 27, 2021. The final hours of Warren Barnes's life began like so many before it, sitting quietly outside the Mesa Mall, reading a paperback. But this day would be different. Around 8:30 p.m., surveillance footage showed Warren getting into a vehicle parked just across the lot. It was cold that night. The man behind the wheel was Brian Cohey Jr., a teenager Warren had likely never met before. But the ride wasn't forced. Warren got in willingly, perhaps trusting Brian's offer of a warm place to rest or something to eat. Instead, they drove west, away from the city, toward a desolate area under Interstate 70. According to Brian's own confession, they parked near a concrete underpass, shielded from the road. He claimed he had planned every step. He brought a knife, a hacksaw, and trash bags. He even wore clothes he intended to throw away afterward. At some point during that ride or shortly after stopping, Brian attacked. The first stab came fast, into Warren's neck. Then another, and another. Brian later told investigators Warren tried to fight back. But at 69 years old and unarmed, he didn't stand a chance. The attack was frenzied, calculated, and brutally efficient. Within minutes, Warren was dead. And then came the second phase, the dismemberment. Brian used the hacksaw to sever Warren's limbs. He took his time, even stopping to rest. It wasn't a panic cleanup, it was cold, systematic. In his confession, Brian noted how surprisingly easy it was to cut through joints. He described the act as if it were an anatomy lab. He placed body parts in plastic bags, some of which were later recovered near the Colorado River. He then drove back home, with Warren's severed head in the car. When police searched his room days later, they found it stored inside a Rubbermaid bin, wrapped in layers of plastic and sealed with tape. It was hidden behind jackets in his closet, feet from where his parents slept. Brian also threw away the murder weapons in multiple dumpsters across the county. He burned his clothes, wiped his car clean, and deleted files from his computer, though not well enough to escape forensic recovery. But what shocked investigators most was that Brian didn't run. He didn't panic. He went back to life as usual: video games, online forums, casual chats with friends. He acted like nothing had happened. In fact, according to his digital footprint, he even revisited true crime discussion boards the next day. Not to confess, but to read reactions, to see if anyone had noticed. They hadn't, yet. For 3 days, the crime remained hidden. Then, the discovery of a severed hand by the river changed everything. Once Brian's name surfaced, the investigation moved fast. A search warrant, a team of detectives, and then the final confirmation: video files on Brian's phone, showing him narrating his own aftermath. He doesn't show the murder, but in one clip he describes where it happened, how it felt, and how he planned to act normal until things cooled off. The tone is eerily calm. No shaking voice. No regret. Just analysis. Like a scientist documenting a test result. The scene under the I-70 overpass told its own story. Blood spatter matched his confession. Drag marks. Boot prints. Tiny bone fragments lodged in the dirt. Every detail Brian had written down matched what investigators found. There was no longer any doubt. This wasn't a moment of madness. It was a fully executed plan. And Warren Barnes was never meant to survive it. By March 2nd, 2021, just days after Warren Barnes's remains began to surface, police already had their suspect. But this case wasn't about chasing a fugitive across state lines. Brian Cohey Jr. wasn't hiding. He was home, in his bedroom, calmly going about his routine. The breakthrough came through a mix of witness tips and digital forensics. A classmate had overheard Brian making offhand comments about killing someone, referencing books on serial killers and asking odd, graphic questions online. It was disturbing, but vague, until Warren disappeared. Then it clicked. Investigators began looking into Brian's search history, computer activity, and movement patterns. What they found solidified their worst fears. He'd been researching body decomposition, dismemberment techniques, and legal strategies for murder suspects. GPS data from his phone placed him at the exact location under I-70 where the attack took place. But it wasn't just location. It was intent. When detectives approached the Cohey residence, Brian was calm, almost too calm. He answered the door and didn't resist when they served the warrant. What officers found inside, though, would stay with them forever. In Brian's closet, hidden beneath layers of winter coats, was a plastic storage container. Inside was the severed head of Warren Barnes, carefully wrapped in plastic and still partially frozen. It was over. Brian was immediately arrested and taken into custody. Later that day, during his formal interview with detectives, Brian waived his rights and confessed. It wasn't coerced. It wasn't emotional. He spoke plainly, like someone recounting a class project. He admitted to every part of the crime: picking up Warren, stabbing him, cutting up the body, transporting the parts, and disposing of them across various sites near the Colorado River. When detectives asked him why, his answer was devastatingly simple. I wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. It was chilling in its honesty. No pretense. No self-pity. Investigators reviewed Brian's video diary entries, where he discussed the murder in unsettling detail. He had filmed himself shortly after the killing, explaining what he had done and how he planned to behave normally until police moved on. But police didn't move on. They built a rock-solid case. Forensic teams recovered DNA from the car, tools, and clothing. Brian's digital footprint documented weeks of planning. His confession was detailed and consistent. And the physical evidence, especially the horrific discovery in his own home, left no room for doubt. By the end of the first week of March, Brian Cohey was charged with first-degree murder, tampering with a deceased human body, and tampering with physical evidence. To the people of Grand Junction, the arrest was a grim relief. They had their answers, but they also had new questions. Who was this boy who walked among them? Who could live like that, so close to his parents, so close to everyone, and harbor something so dark? The arrest didn't bring Warren Barnes back, but it stopped Brian from ever doing it again. And now the case was headed to trial, where the question wouldn't be whether Brian did it, but whether the justice system could truly understand why. The trial of Brian Cohey Jr. didn't begin with suspense. It began with certainty. By the time he stood before a jury in early 2023, the facts of the case were overwhelming. There was no mystery about who killed Warren Barnes. Brian had confessed. The evidence was airtight. The courtroom wasn't waiting for a twist. They were waiting for a reckoning. Over the course of the trial, prosecutors presented a chilling timeline of the murder. from Brian's meticulous planning to the calculated disposal of Warren's body. They displayed his typed confession, read aloud his search history, and played excerpts from the self-recorded videos he made after the killing. He spoke on camera in a level tone, describing how he had always wanted to try it. "I didn't feel much," he said. "It was easier than I thought." For jurors, those clips were impossible to forget. The defense didn't dispute that Brian had committed the murder. Instead, they leaned into mental health. They argued that Brian had long suffered from undiagnosed psychological issues, that his obsession with death and serial killers was a symptom of deeper pathology, not pure evil. Psychologists were brought in to evaluate him. They agreed he had traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder and severe emotional detachment, but none of them declared him legally insane. Brian knew what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. He just didn't care. On February 3, 2023, after a short deliberation, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder.
Well, a family finds justice after waiting 2 years to find out the man who murdered their loved one, what he'd be sentenced to in prison. 21-year-old Brian Cohey murdered and dismembered Warren Barnes back in 2021. Cohey claimed he was insane at the time, therefore not guilty. The jury didn't find his defense convincing enough. They found Cohey guilty on all counts. On count 1, first-degree murder, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And on counts 2 and 3, tampering with human remains, 12 years in prison to be served consecutively. And count 4, tampering with evidence, he was sentenced to 18 months. Family members made several victim statements asking for the maximum sentence.
The sentence was mandatory, life in prison without the possibility of parole. In addition, the judge added more than 13 years for tampering with a deceased human body and tampering with physical evidence. As the sentence was read aloud, Brian remained stone-faced. He didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He just stood there. Members of the community gave statements, some trembling through tears. A store clerk from Mesa Mall recalled how Warren would quietly thank her for sandwiches. Another resident spoke of his guilt, that he'd seen Warren the day before his death and never said goodbye. And though Warren had no known family present in court, his absence was deeply felt. He had become a symbol of vulnerability, of dignity, of how society overlooks people until it's too late. After the verdict, Grand Junction tried to move forward, but the case lingered. Not because people feared Brian would strike again, he was locked away, but because of the coldness of it all. The randomness. The way it shattered the illusion that a quiet man with a book could be left alone. Warren's statue still stands outside the Dillard's entrance, a permanent tribute to the man who asked for nothing, but gave peace to everyone who passed him. And now, next to it, is a plaque etched with a simple quote from a local teacher. He reminded us what it looked like to sit still and be kind. In a world that often rushes by, Warren Barnes had made people pause. His killer had hoped to erase him, but the community made sure he would be remembered. Warren Barnes lived simply. He had no home, no phone, no family nearby. But he had books, he had routine, and he had peace. What happened to him wasn't a crime of passion or greed. It was a deliberate act by a young man obsessed with violence, a man who studied death like a subject and treated Warren not as a person, but as an opportunity. It's easy to think of monsters as shadows in the dark, but sometimes they live next door. They shop at the same stores. They smile for the same cameras. Brian Cohey Jr. didn't kill for love or money or revenge. He killed because he wanted to know what it felt like. What does that say about us? About the systems that failed to see the signs? About a world where a man can vanish from his spot on the sidewalk and no one notices until it's too late? Warren didn't deserve to be a victim. He deserved to be seen. So let's remember him not just for how he died, but for how he lived, quiet, kind, and endlessly curious. What do you think this case reveals about our society? About how we treat the invisible, and how we miss the ones who need the most protection? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one. If you want more deep dive true crime stories like this, be sure to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a case. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, kindness matters even in silence. You've been watching True Crime Radar.